very kindly, Dr. Linda Bos has agreed to come and talk to us and give us a sort of a layperson's. You're our first academic speaker here today. We aren't necessarily an academic conference, so you're not going to have anybody at the microphone sort of questioning your sources or your normative theoretical models or something. We're just interested to learn about the insights from this fascinating research. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and let you take it away, Linda, and uh, share your
Thank you,
experience.
Esko. Yeah, and thank you very much for the invitation. So can you hear me well, I hope? Okay. And can you see my slides? And the slides only, or all other kinds of?
We can see both you and the slides.
Okay, good. Okay, that's good. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a bit indeed about the paper that I wrote and that Esko asked me about. I hope to give a layman speech. I'm not very accustomed to it. So if you have any questions, please raise them at the end. So I wanted to talk about the role a political movement can have on citizens' attitudes, and attitudes that are specifically at odds with democracy or can be threatening to democracy. So I will just talk about two theoretical concepts and how they are related and how we actually see them in society. And I'll also give some solutions. Oh, and I actually made a slide with the overview, right? So it's about populism and political intolerance. I will first lay out what these two concepts are in academic conceptions, then talk about why they might be related, and then just very quickly show some results from a recent study that I did. And then I will present some possible solutions. So I'm not very practical, so I'm really an academic. So I hope that, that we can talk a bit about that. Because these solutions that I have are also derived from theory or academic research. Okay, so the two key concepts that I'm talking about here is, first of all, political intolerance. So what is political intolerance? Political intolerance is the unwillingness to extend civil liberties to groups or individuals one opposes. And of course, then political tolerance is that you oppose a specific group or a specific individual because of their political standing, for instance, but then you are willing to extend civil liberties to them, even though you disagree with them. So this means that some people refuse to grant people they disagree with civil liberties or even rights. So for instance, some people would argue that some groups in society, right? So there are many studies in this field on the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, right? Or terrorists. They are not allowed to demonstrate or run for public office. That's political intolerance. Now, of course, it might make sense to say, well, maybe not such a good idea to let the Ku Klux Klan have demonstrations, right? So in a sense, it's also not the case that political intolerance is something that's always bad or something that we never want, right? Because it can also be a safeguard to democracy when the groups that we are intolerant against are actually intolerant themselves or pose a threat to the functioning of the liberal democratic order, right? So this can be Ku Klux Klan, but also neo-Nazis or groups supporting political violence or groups that violate democratic norms. So then it's actually a good idea maybe, or you have good reasons to be intolerant. But in many other cases, we can also perceive intolerance towards groups that you just disagree with. And there's a lot of research that shows that, especially like extremist citizens, so people that hold an extremist view. So and that doesn't have to be like radical or anti-democratic, right? So people on the utmost left of the left-right scale that are really leftist or extremely right-wing, they're usually more intolerant towards people that are at the other end of the political spectrum, right? So the people on the extreme left might be more intolerant towards the people on the extreme right and the other way around. So in that case, it's more based on issue agreement or ideological disagreement that people think, okay, because I disagree with you, I think you should not be allowed to vote or to go out on the street and demonstrate or be elected for office, right? That might be more problematic because political tolerance protects the right to express an unpopular opinion, right? So it could be the case that indeed you disagree with those people on the other side of the political spectrum, those far left individuals or those far left groups, but it's important to also grant their rights to express whatever opinion they have, because it guarantees their individual freedom, it allows a free marketplace of ideas, and it also ensures a peaceful transfer of power. And this is, of course, what we saw in the US, where specific groups said, okay, I don't think you should be able to run for office, right? So in that case, this is a real threat to liberal democracy. Okay, I also gave some, I just tried to add some examples. So here are some tweets of people being politically intolerant, right? So they're saying, well, because you have a certain opinion, you should not be allowed to vote, or because you have another opinion, you should not be allowed to run for office, or you cannot be a teacher if you have this and this opinion, or you shouldn't be able to protest or get airtime. So these are examples in which people are politically intolerant. Now, the second concept that's key is populism. And populism we define in academia, usually based on this definition or a similar definition that has the same concepts in them, as a set of ideas claiming that society is divided into two monolithic blocks, the people and the elite, and that the relation between these good people and the corrupt or the bad elite is antagonistic, right? So their interests are opposed to each other, and that politics should be an expression of the general will. So that's what the pure people want. Now, so in academia, populism isn't necessarily left or right, as you can see here. It's sort of an empty ideology, or a thin ideology, as we call it. So you can be a left-wing populist, and then you combine this set of ideas with socialism, for instance, but you can also be right-wing populist, right? And then you combine this set of ideas with nativism. So you can find it at several places on the political spectrum. And the upside of defining populism as a set of ideas means that you can find it not only in parties, right? So you can see what their platform is and then see how populist they are, right? So for instance, we have the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, that's clearly populist, the Swiss People Party, the Rassemblement National, the Finns Party, but you can also see it in text. So you can see whether party manifestos, to what extent are they actually populist, or political speeches, or tweets, or media coverage, right? So, or investigative journalism can also be populist. But you can also, and that's what this study was about, you can also find it among voters. So they can be more or less agreeable with the idea that society is divided into two monolithic blocks, the people and the elite, and that the relation between the good people and the corrupt elite is antagonistic, and that politics should be an expression of the general will. So we do see that there are voters that agree with this more or less, and these voters are usually also more likely to vote for these parties, for instance. And the other way around, we also see that if you expose people to more populist communication, which is also a field I study, so this is finding these ideas in text, then people are also more likely to grow these populist attitudes. So we sort of see a circle there. Now, these are also some examples. So this is again in text, right? So here's what you see actually. People that are very negative about the elite, very positive about the people. And they're saying that we should listen to the people and that they should have the power, right? So these are all examples of populist statements. Now, in a recent study, my colleagues and I wondered whether the growing intolerance we see online might be related to populism, right? So not only can we see that more intolerant tweets or Facebook posts by actors that are considered populist, right? So the examples I just showed, in some cases, you can actually also see some intolerance there. But we also thought it might be the case that these populist citizens, so these citizens that agree more with the populist set of ideas, are more likely to be intolerant. And if this is indeed the case, then if you have an increasing number of populist parties, right, and an increasing number of populist communication, and you have more and more people having populist attitudes, could it be also be the case then that you get more and more people that are politically intolerant, right? And that can then pose a threat to democracy because it erodes key democratic values. But first we had to find out, of course, well, maybe this is just an idea and it doesn't make any sense. Well, the idea was based on theory, because we know that political intolerance is fueled by perceived threats. So if you feel more threatened by a specific group of people, right? So the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis or people you just strongly disagree with, then you feel more threatened. So because they pose a threat to your values, right? So in the case of this left versus right distinction, people who are extremely on the right, they feel that these people that are extremely on the left, that they pose a threat to their values that they really care about. Now, populists, as I just said, they see the elite and the groups that are not part of the people as threats, right? Because the elite are corrupt, the people are good, right? So the elite is a threat by definition. And then whether you are a left-wing or right-wing populist, or the thick ideology, as we call it in theory, also affects who else is not part of the people, right? So if you're a right-wing populist, then you think, well, immigrants, Muslims, they are not part of the people. They are also a threat. If you're a left-wing populist, then it's, for instance, capitalists. They are also a threat to the people, to the values of the people. So these people are threats. So that's already a link, right? So it's in political intolerance, and that could breed political intolerance, we assume. Now, in addition, as I just said, right, there's not only this pro-people and against elite, but there is also the assumption that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. Well, if the people is at the heart of populism, why should we even allow these other groups a voice in the political process? So theoretically, it makes sense that people that have strong populist attitudes that agree with this set of ideas, that they are more likely to perceive threat and less likely to grant these other groups their rights. Now, what we did a study in the Netherlands with Dutch voters in a long household panel, and we had different measures of intolerance, very general measures, but also very specific measures in which we said, okay, if you think about this group, and it was then a group that they disagree with, to what extent would you grant these people these and these and these rights? And then we had, oh no, this is just the findings. As I said, I would just summarize it. So what we found was that voters with stronger populist attitudes, they are less supportive of democratic norms, and these were various democratic norms. They are more intolerant online, so they are less tolerant towards people they disagree with online. And this is, of course, what we also see, right, in these tweets, that people are just don't want to hear from specific people. And they're also more intolerant of the opponent. So they're more intolerant of these people that they disagree with. So indeed, this was in line with what we expected. I have to add that we also saw some results that were in the other direction. So we also saw that they support others' opinions more, and that they are not more intolerant unto other measures. But the overarching conclusion is that populist voters are more intolerant. And this is, of course, problematic for the reasons I said, right? So lower levels of intolerance hinder individual freedom, and they obstruct a free marketplace of ideas. And what's important to add here, right? So what we find is, what we saw before is that these political extremists, so the people on the extreme left and the extreme right, they are not the only ones that are more intolerant, but also specific groups within the electorate too. And these people don't necessarily have to be on the extreme left or the extreme right. They can also be more in the middle, right? Which is also where these parties can be. Now, as I said, right, I would also talk about some possible solutions. This is not my expertise, but I was asked to give a few ideas. Well, first of all, threat builds intolerance. So yeah, what would be a solution is maybe a perceived decrease in threat that might also decrease intolerance. And what we saw in previous research, when researchers focused on religion, that if you expose people to inclusive religious values, ones that are shared by different religions, they become more tolerant. But when they're exposed to exclusive religious values, so exclusive to a specific religion, then they become less tolerant because they perceive more threat from the other religions, right? So if you talk about Catholicism specifically, then you perceive more threat from the Islam than when you talk about common religious values, for instance. So likewise, you could also propose, and I have not studied this, but could study this, of course, to develop communication efforts in which commonalities between different groups in societies are underlined, so such as moral values, right? So what actually unites us instead of what actually divides us. And there has been research on that before, but that's not necessarily targeted at populism or political intolerance, but in related fields, and that seems to work, right? So having a more inclusive type of communication. And related, perceived reciprocity is also a remedy. So if the opponent is willing to grant you your civil rights, then you're also less intolerant in return. That's also been shown before. So, and that's because it decreases threat, right? So if you are very intolerant towards the outgroup, but you actually hear that the outgroup is not intolerant towards you, that means that they might actually be less threatening than you thought before. So that might also be a solution. And this would imply that like reciprocal actions and experience, but also social interactions might actually decrease intolerance. So the solution might lie actually in interactions, but also in communications, I would say. Yeah, that's what I had here. Thank you, that's it. Let me see. Stop sharing. Let me see here. I don't know how to stop share here. Oh, here.
Thank you very much, Linda. I'm sorry, I was a little bit distracted by some. There are some questions in the. There's one question in the chat. Would you like to address that directly?
Yeah, let me see.
It's from Lisa Tang.
Yeah, I'm thinking there will be more environmental refugees and more conflicts due to climate change and stress on environmental resources. What about EDI? I don't know what it is, such as race, nationality, and religion. Them and us thinking, how can we influence the decision makers so it's not just a, I'm not sure what the question is. Equality, diversity, and inclusion. I'm not sure what the question is. How can we influence decision makers so it's not just a tick box exercise for them? I think to make clear that indeed, also in the communication, indeed in this case about environmental refugees and more conflicts, that it's much more inclusive also in the communication, I would say. I think that's very important in these cases. And actually, I'm also involved in a research project in which we look at climate change, refugees, and the role or the way in which policymakers mainly and European politicians discuss about these issues. And our expectation is that they do that very much in a us and them framework, using a lot of emotional cues. And the question is, right, what would be a solution there instead of talking in very black and white fashion? And I think indeed, I'm not sure. So I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure what the status is, right? But I'm afraid that indeed the policy is to be very diverse and inclusive, but in communication, and there's still a lot to win. Equality, oh yeah, and then another question, how can people train their skill in recognizing populism in others and in themselves? That's a good question. I think So I was also involved in the network once on populist communication, and we made some YouTube videos, and they are actually very informative. And I sometimes think that they should be shared more, and people should see them more, because I think it's very clear. In the sense that it's very easy to then recognize populism in movements, in texts, in parties, right? But in yourself, that's actually quite difficult, I would say. Then I wonder, and I think there's also, right, it's also more of a normative discussion. To what extent is populism really that bad, right? Because it's also important that politics is an expression of the general will, but it shouldn't be an expression of like a very specific general will only of a specific group of people, but it should be an expression of the general will of us. So there's also a lot of research that says that populism is also like a safeguard to democracy. So that's difficult to say, I would say.
Yeah,
But I think if indeed in general, just having a common understanding of what populism is might also help in seeing it, finding it in yourself, right? Or seeing it and recognizing it. And I don't think that the academic definition of populism is that widespread. So in general, the popular conception is a bit different from how we see it.
I think that was key. Like what really struck me in your presentation was that populism itself is kind of a neutral set of descriptions, and it can
Yeah.
exist on all sides of the spectrum. And if, for example, I myself am a little bit left-leaning in my politics, I see things I don't like on the right, and I put a badge and say those are populists, and that's bad.
Yeah.
But how can I interrogate my own behaviors and say, like, am I also a populist? And in
Yeah.
their eyes, sort of seen as just as bad as yeah, like they perceive me. But one interesting thing from the question that we had was, um, from our experience and our research in this particular territory, it's the solutions that you propose, say, are talking about like finding common ground, and finding a platform where we can have fruitful discussions and
Mhm.
rapprochement and stuff. But it appears that those who are using tactics from the populist playbook actually find advantages in the division, you know,
Yeah.
and this intolerance, the in and the out group and stuff. So
Yeah.
we come to an interesting conundrum. Like now our job is, how do we convince people who find advantage in creating differences and in and out groups and stuff, when our solution is to try to create some rapprochement and more common ground? They seem to be like oil and water
Yeah.
kind of thing, and antithesis. I don't know that you can answer that question for us immediately.
No, yeah, I think indeed that's a real problem that you see there. Yeah, I think in general, what's always important is to question the motives of these populists and to also make clear where the problems are in their argumentation, right? So the solution is also always something black and white, but the world isn't black and white, right? So they come up with a very simple solution for your problems, but this solution is not realistic. So indeed, but that's a different, that doesn't really solve this political intolerance issue. Yeah, I think it's a very, yeah, but it's a good point. Yeah. At the other, on the other hand, we also see that that their black and white argumentation and their very, yeah, simple solutions also can backfire, right? Because in the end, many voters actually want to vote for a party. This is research I did years ago that's effective, as I just said, and legitimate. And that means that they don't want a party that's undemocratic. So if it's too harsh and too extreme, they don't want to vote for it. And if it's just only shouting simple solutions, they also don't want to vote for it because they know that they will never have an impact. So your vote is just lost. So in the end, I think, and the hope is that will sort of backfire on them. But indeed, that doesn't mean that the communication isn't still out there, and it sort of draws people apart, and that's a problem. Yeah.
I wonder if you can comment on, I don't know if you'll be able to, but I think one thing we've perceived is what you might call a policy innovation from recent outright populist people. I have people like Trump in mind, but also happening in other places, which is developing policy through rapid feedback loops. So, for example, saying something very outrageous on Twitter and then
Yeah.
watching the response coming into that. And if the base is activated and thinking like, yes, this horrible idea, we're quite into that, then it kind of evolves into policy, and some things that don't get the desired reaction get abandoned very quickly. And paired with that is the volume of things. So there was Amy Siskind in the US is notable for writing a list every day of the next most egregious thing that comes out of the government, which isn't kind of, conforming to traditional democratic norms and standards. And so the defense against this fire hose of outrageous propositions was to keep meticulous records about it, so that there is, one day when the Nuremberg trials or whatever equivalent comes, all of it is kind of recorded. So I think they're related, somewhat different things. In your research on the kind of behavioral patterns of populists, do you find that as a kind of a going trend, and what could we do about that?
Yeah, I think actually, so coming up with these outrageous ideas and just shouting, right? In the field where I'm in, so I'm in political communication research. That is seen as a way to attract media attention, newsworthiness, and in the end, what they do, right? So they shout very loudly and they come up with very outrageous ideas that raises a lot of attention. You cannot really escape it. You have to talk about it, and then at the end, what they say, oh well, that wasn't how I meant it. So that's what we see. And I think with Wodak, I'm always it's like the pendulum just goes back and forth, right? So they keep on shouting, then they sort of take it back, and then they shout again. So they just keep on getting the attention. I do wonder whether they are really serious about these ideas. Sometimes it's a very good way to keep on staying at the political agenda and to just keep on getting attention. It works. And you see, what we do see right now is that the research about this has also reached journalists who have become much more aware of this situation and like the current trend that they're in, and they are really thinking about how to deal with this. So we have seen, and journalists first jumping on the bandwagon, writing articles, putting it on the broadcast news, but then you sort of see that now they keep it quiet if it's too extreme. So there is something going on there. Yeah, whether we should really take it that serious, I wonder, because maybe sometimes we shouldn't take it too serious.
Okay, we do have just a little extra time. We're still waiting for our next speaker, but there was one from Emily Sputh. Political parties tend to front enemies to get people engaged. The opposite, embracing what unites political parties on the other side, has a tendency to make people confused and apathetic. What's your thoughts on this? When is it then wise?
Yeah, that's of course that's the whole that's this is the key issue, right? So how can you relate to voters? And we know that this black and white and this very in-group, out-group type of communication that works for some people, but we also know that it doesn't work for all people, right? So some people just want to vote for a party that's, as I said, effective, right? So that really can change something in parliament or in policy that you care about. So in that case, people can be very pragmatic. So I wonder whether they are also always confused about that. I think parties can still make clear what their profile is and how that differs from others, but that they can still be willing to compromise with others instead of only lining out what the differences are and making sure that there will no be way in the future that they will work together. I think that's there's a midway there.
There was one, perhaps very quickly, the last one was, is it possible to fight bad actors in discussions without seeming to allow for more political? So how do you break the cycle, really,
Yeah.
without becoming the politically intolerant? Or
Yeah, I think that's but what are bad actors, right? So in which I think you should, the problem of course is that you should always try to still connect to people and try to talk to them. So when is someone really that bad that you cannot, that you shouldn't, that you should stop talking? I wonder, yeah,
yeah,
I think it's always important to still, and then I think it's important in this case to be empathetic always, right? So to say, okay, I'm just worried about this and this, and I think you're worried about it too, to find some common ground. Um, but in discussions, I think you should always try to discuss with everyone. Yeah.
great. I think that's a great point to wrap on, and maybe that's food for thought for our deliberations tomorrow. Like, at what point is the dialogue still possible? I'm envisaging when people start killing each other, then you can
Yeah.
probably say that's a bad actor and the dialogue isn't working, um, which is happening in some places. So,
Yeah.
Linda, thank you very much for
Hey, you're
your
welcome.
presentation. I'll stop the recording and we'll transition over